right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have you here. I'm Phil Levy. I am Senior Fellow on the Global Economy here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's wonderful to have Derek Scissors here with us, an old friend and colleague of mine. We would like to thank AEI and the Adam Smith Society, our partners for this event. Before we begin, a couple housekeeping notes. Today's event is on the record and live streamed. We always welcome your social media engagement, and please do silence your phone so as not to disrupt. Please also note that the Chicago Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Later on, we will be taking audience questions from the room or online at chi.cnf.io. That's chi.cnf.io. All right, business out of the way. Let's turn to what's going on between the U.S. and China. So this is a remarkably fluid situation. As you and I started talking about things, it seems to sort of change day by day. If we look at the administration's stance on this, how steadfast and united is the Trump administration on these issues?
They would have you believe that they're united. That is not what the track record of the last year and a half says. I do talk to the administration on a regular basis. There are understandable and fundamental differences in views. Understandable because it's not as if parts of the administration are saying something completely ridiculous and the other part of the administration is right. It's that they have completely different views on how to proceed. I would say one group is largely in favor of the 2016 status quo. Not that they don't want better Chinese behavior, but within the confines of, hey, let's maintain the relationship. It's been positive for both countries. Of course, the president ran on certain issues. We need some progress from China on those issues. But the goal should be to keep us moving forward with expanding engagement with China. And Secretary Mnuchin is probably the leading proponent of that view. All the way to the other side, there are people in the administration who see the Chinese as the New York Times provided. Hello, New York Times provided. You guys, did anyone hear anything I said before then? It was brilliant. Your stock portfolios will thank you. Oh well. So there is a fundamental division in the administration about whether we should be engaging China more, hoping to improve the relationship, but nonetheless staying on the track of engagement with China. Secretary Mnuchin is associated with that view correctly. And then a view on another part of the administration that we are headed towards a long period of, hopefully not military, but economic, social, political conflict with China. And having a larger economic relationship with a government led by a Maoist dictator is a very strange course for the United States to pursue. And you can see these two views are not reconcilable. And I hope that you see some merit in both of them, even if you're on one side or the other. And in between, I think the president is in between. He doesn't fit comfortably in either side. He ran as somebody opposed to the China status quo, but he has not governed as someone who wants to separate from China economically. Ambassador Lighthizer is also in between. I would say the view I'm talking about that in favor of more separation is primarily in this national security community. So that's why you get press reports that seem to contradict each other from one day to the next, because the Wall Street Journal reporter is talking to Treasury, and the New York Times reporter is talking to USTR, and Bloomberg is talking to the Defense Department. It may also possibly be that the president changes his mind sometimes, and guidance from the White House to the rest of the administration changes more frequently than under previous presidents. But, right now, we're still headed for a deal, but there's no way anyone should be surprised if that doesn't work.
Okay, I want to come back to, we'll talk about deal aspect. I usually think of you in the more hawkish side of things, perhaps more in line with the skeptics.
Yes.
Is it a viable option to think about disengaging from China?
I certainly think so. Now, when I've advocated for decoupling, which I've done for a number of years now, it's in response to the current political leadership in China. For those of you who are hostile to my viewpoint, I would argue that China now is very different than China 10 years ago in terms of its leadership and its political direction. Is it feasible? I am not saying that the U.S. should separate from China entirely. I'm saying that let's keep Chinese students on American campuses. I taught Chinese students for a number of years. I'm very glad I did. But let's keep Chinese researchers out of advanced technology projects on American campuses. The trade relationship between the U.S. and China is not something we should target for increasing. Maybe the easiest way to put it is the president thinks a lot more U.S. exports to China is clearly a good thing. And it clearly is a good thing for the U.S. economy, assuming those exports aren't just diverted from exports to other partners. But if we were just to add exports to China on top of U.S. economic performance now, that would be a good thing. I don't want to be more closely tied into this Chinese government. In Washington, we have a lot of problems dealing with Chinese political influence. Export more to China, you get more Chinese political influence. So we can argue about what the extent of disengagement should be. But one thing for sure is I don't think we should be expanding our trade relationship. When we added into the investment review process, pardon me, I was sick last week, and now I sound sick, but I feel fine. When we changed the U.S. investment review process last year, and made it harder for Chinese firms to invest in certain sectors of the American economy. That didn't end Chinese investment, but it did limit it. And I think that was a step forward. That's the kind of disengagement I'm talking about. It's let's not expand the relationship further, and let's look for some places where it would be valuable to limit it.
Does it concern you that this could put the U.S. economy at a disadvantage? I mean, you talked about how exports can be good. Imports can be good. I mean, you can have companies that are viable. Apple is one that comes to mind, right, because they are able to have supply chains where they source efficiently all around the world. They have competitors in places like Korea or Europe who will clearly have access to the Chinese market. Isn't it a bit of a concern that if you cut yourself off from that can be damaging?
Look, there's absolutely going to be an economic cost to partially disengaging from China. There was a hearing today, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I advised one of the senators speaking there. I said, start off with the idea of a cost. Because if you're not willing to pay any cost, then we're just pretending that we're having a China debate. We're just pretending that we're going to do something different. And there are plenty of people in this room, maybe there's certainly people in the tech community, in the agricultural community, in the financial community, who don't want to pay a cost. So I understand that viewpoint. There's absolutely going to be a cost, and we have to figure out, okay, what is it going to be? Some universities are going to lose tuition. Some companies are going to have to switch sources of supply, and it will happen easily, but others it won't happen easily. So yes, there's a cost to doing this. If you're going to do anything worthwhile, there usually is. I would put it in context that there are some people who think that China's role in the world economy is timeless and irreplaceable. It came out of WTO entry. That production was located elsewhere, and it moved into China after China entered the WTO. And it can move out of China. It's actually going to move out of China to some extent, regardless of what we do, because China has become less competitive as a producer on the low end. So some supply is going to move out of China if we do nothing. I think we should be pushing more supply out of China. No question that's going to hurt some American firms.
So you advise to sort of start with cost, but presumably you think there's a benefit that offsets this. Is this that you see this as prompting political change in China, better insulating the U.S.? What is it you see as the benefit?
There are a lot of possible benefits. It depends on how we do it and how well we do it. Let's take one benefit. If we were to respond effectively to Chinese IP coercion and theft, coercion being we're supposed to give you access to the Chinese market unconditionally on WTO rules, but we're only going to give you access if you share your technological developments with us. Theft being the obvious, they just steal it. If we had an effective response to that, we would get less of it. We wouldn't get none of it. It's not China would suddenly become a perfect IP partner, but we would get less. There's no reason now for Chinese firms to stop receiving coerced or stolen IP because there are never any consequences. Why would they stop? I don't expect it to cause political change in China. I don't think there's much prospect of that, unfortunately. I'll give you another example. The Belt and Road Initiative, I hope most of you have heard of it. I'm not particularly worried about it. There's some aspects of it that I'm worried. Some aspects I think are positive. But for American policymakers who are worried about it, I would point out that it's funded by us, American consumers. When the Belt and Road was started, China had a huge balance of payment surplus, of which merchandise trade with the U.S. was part, but not all. They don't have a balance of payment surplus anymore. Their extra foreign currency comes from merchandise trade with the United States. The end. If we wanted to stop the Belt and Road, we could just buy fewer products made in China. Now, maybe all of you are thinking, why would we want to stop the Belt and Road? I actually agree with you. But in Washington, we have a lot of people who are very worried about the Belt and Road, and the government needs to get bigger, and it needs to have more money, and it needs to spend, in counter to the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road is financed with our money. And if you wanted a gain from buying less Chinese goods, you'd have less Chinese money to engage in activities overseas, for better or worse.
I thought Belt and Road was predominantly loans.
Belt and Road is predominantly loans in foreign currency that don't get repaid,
right,
and it draws on China's foreign exchange reserves, which comes from its merchandise trade surplus with the United States since 2014, not before then.
Which does bring up a larger question, which is, to the extent that China is, that sounds like an unsustainable policy. If you do something where you thought you were writing lots of loans, but you don't actually get repaid for them, and then you end up making expenditures which you weren't really counting on, these things, that thing sounds somewhat self-limiting, which I might argue is true of a lot of these Chinese policies, that if you want to develop world-class brands, you'd better have some degree of intellectual property protection at home, or people are not going to invest the time in this. If you'd like to have researchers who stay home and do things as opposed to getting seaside palaces in Vancouver, you need to make sure that it's a viable thing to actually succeed in China. To what extent do you think this is a process that the U.S. is going to influence or needs to, assume a cost influence versus, I think you and I would both agree, there's plenty of mistakes that the current Chinese administration is making. Do we need to be the one to force them to stop their mistakes?
So I had this.
Are you saying that we should be the world's policeman? Is that what you're saying for me?
The world's economic policeman.
Yeah.
I'm in the uncomfortable position in Washington a lot of saying, I think the Chinese are bad actors that are harming the United States, and I don't think they're going to take over the world economically, which is where you're going with that, and I agree 100%. If we wanted to talk about the Chinese macroeconomy rather than US-China, I would tell you that I think China is on the road to stagnation. They're an aging country, not aged yet, but aging. They've run up an enormous amount of debt. They limit innovation because they block competition in a number of sectors. If we're just worried about, is China going to become a peer to the United States, I would say stop worrying about China. They're never going to become a peer to the United States. We may no longer become a global economic power. We may shoot ourselves in the foot. It's more likely than the Chinese catching up to us. Having said that, the Chinese can engage in a lot of harmful activities and have engaged in a lot of harmful activities. You don't have to create a great firm that will lead innovation and do a great job servicing its customers to drive other firms out of business with subsidies. You can just drive those firms out of business with subsidies and become an anti-competitive monopolist, which is the Chinese goal in a lot of sectors. So I agree with you that there are a lot of flaws in what they're doing, and I think those flaws are already manifesting themselves and will manifest themselves in a view. Already people think differently of China now than they did 10 years ago. And 10 years from now, we're all going to think of China differently again. We're not going to think of it as a dynamic, rapidly growing economy, in my opinion. But in the meantime, they can do a lot of harmful things. And China doing harmful things because of their size is different than Belize doing harmful things. And therefore, even though many of their development model, in my opinion, is ultimately unsustainable, how much damage are we going to allow them to inflict on the United States in the pursuit of that development model? And my answer is there's no reason for us to do that. It's not like China in 1999, where they were liberalizing economically, and they were even becoming more open socially. That's not the direction China is going in. We're not harming a country that's trying to do the right thing. We're harming a country, in my opinion, that's trying to do the wrong thing. And therefore, we don't have a reason to hold back just because they're never going to become as rich as the United States is.
So you've talked about a couple of interesting things I want to come back to. So one, you talked about just now, this is not the China that, say, we engaged with when we were talking about WTO accession, which I will agree with. To what extent, though, are we able to sort of set up global supply chains and commercial rules and a global trading structure that's going to fluctuate with changes in governance in each country? I mean, there's a certain chance they look at the U.S. and say that wasn't the country we lined up against either, given the current administration. To what extent do we say, we're shutting things down because we don't like this administration, and then we sort of rev them back up because we like, the successor, assuming that Xi Jinping is not immortal?
Well, that was well said. What successor? He has not designated a successor because he doesn't want to have a successor, and I think he would love to be immortal. Previous Chinese governments, under a sort of informal rule created by Deng Xiaoping, who walked off the stage when he didn't need to, under that rule, Xi Jinping would be gone in 2022. Mm-hmm. And I would be advocating for very time-specific U.S. action to signal to the next Chinese leader, you can't do what he did. But I would also be saying, I really hope the new president in 2021 says, when China's ready to change, we're ready to change. I'll hop on a plane if you're ready to be different. But he doesn't want to leave in 2022. He doesn't want to leave in 2027. So we're not looking at a situation where it's just an administration change. This is not, President Trump doesn't like Angela Merkel, and one of them is going to leave first, and then the other will be able to deal with somebody better. This is somebody who doesn't want to leave, who's going to try to outlast the current president and the next president of the United States. And he would love to be the senior leader after the next president after that.
Do you think he's totally unaccountable? Or are there sort of constituencies, the PLA or whoever, that he needs to keep happy?
Sure. I mean, it's not a perfect dictatorship. So, of course, there are other interests. The reason I mentioned the lack of successor is you need an alternative. The Communist Party of China hates instability above all things. If there's no alternative to Xi Jinping, then you can't get rid of him without a period of instability, which means his position, not every action he takes, not that he'll be immune to all criticism, but his position is unchallenged. There's no one else to rally around. And the person who's number 2 in the party hierarchy, he has made invisible also for exactly that reason. This is a cult of personality dictatorship. And again, if you may violently disagree with that, I understand. But if you don't know why I'm saying that, do some work on what Xi Jinping's China looks like as compared to Hu Jintao's China or Jiang Zemin's China. So I don't think he's unassailable, but I think the party, because the party has no option other than instability, he'll be there till he screws up.
Okay, just to challenge this.
Good.
So you've got several positions that he sits in right now. There's 3 or so, isn't it? 3 sort of big hats. Isn't there some tradition of saying, okay, well, he's going to wear 2 hats and somebody else is going to take on one of his powers? You could do this without having rioting in the streets.
Okay, so he's president, which is a kind of unimportant political position. He's general secretary of the Communist Party, which is the real position. As an extension of general secretary of the Communist Party, he's chairman of the Central Military Commission. He could easily give up the presidency, but it just wouldn't mean anything.
Okay, so one of the others.
Right, and there's no one. That's the process by which I assume he's going to create a Medvedev-type successor, a complete puppet, where he'll put them into one position, he'll keep the other 2, and this person will be a puppet. I think the only way to justify or rationalize Xi Jinping's actions is he wants to be considered great the way Deng Xiaoping and Mao Zedong were. Now, you and I, audience might not agree, you and I agree, that's not going to come from his current economic policies. That's not going to deliver greatness to China. That makes him, in my opinion, quite dangerous to deal with. Where is the greatness going to come from? Nationalism, reunification with Taiwan, whether Taiwan wants it or not, confrontation with Japan as to establish China as a premier power in East Asia. That's what I believe he's looking for. Of course, there are differences of opinion possible. If it's not going to be delivered in terms of economic success the way Deng's was, that makes him more of closer to an enemy than just a competitor.
But that raises the question then of whether some of the policies that the administration is taking are leading us to a more dangerous place. That if the president's premise at many points has seemed to have been, China seems vulnerable, we can take some of these actions, such as the application of tariffs, and that will push them farther down. They've got slowing growth and the like. And his presumption seems to be then they will sort of change their policies to accommodate us. As you were just suggesting, what if instead they decide they need to stoke nationalism or provoke a Taiwan confrontation, for example?
So there are a number of points on which I disagree with the president. He has a consistent policy in the sense of he's not asking really for that much from the Chinese. The deal will have unenforceable, in my opinion, IP provisions. The Chinese have signed lots of unenforceable IP agreements. He'll ask them to divert
purchases of some goods from other countries to the United States, they're fine with doing that. So the president is trying to pressure the Chinese, but pressure them to an outcome they can live with. If we were to become harsher towards China, we would see that nationalist backlash. We would see China has been very careful not to target American companies based in China because there are natural political allies of China in the debate within the United States. If the U.S. were to go to a 25% broad tariff that would threaten China's balance of payments, we would see a harsher reaction. So there is a danger. I don't think that's where the Trump administration is heading. The president wants a deal to say, I got better terms from the Chinese than Obama and Bush did. He doesn't want a confrontation that actually backs China into a corner. He just wants them to realize that we have the advantage and they should be nice to us and give him a good deal. So that's why I said he's not.
But you don't think they will be nice to us?
This gets back to my point of disagreement with the president. I don't want to sell more goods to China. I want them to stop stealing from us so much. And so he has a different set of goals. On what I care about, I don't see any prospect that the Chinese will become better partners. On what the president cares about, they'll buy more stuff. We'll be able to see it. So that's a point of disagreement, and why I said the president is not in the camp of disengagement. He's in the camp of tweak the engagement for what he sees as better terms than we got under Obama and Bush.
And does that risk putting us in sort of a no man's land in between, where you haven't done enough to make any real change, but you've done enough to sort of annoy the Chinese and damage commercial relationships?
I think the no man's land here is very broad. I don't think the U.S. has settled at all on a China policy. I think no matter who is president in 2021, there could be more changes from now. So you imagine President Trump winning again. He's not going to run a third time. So the politics are gone. I think we get a different President Trump than we get as we get in 2020 when he's a candidate. If a Democrat wins, there are so many different options. To be blunt, some Democrats, I fear, would be too dependent on money from the tech industry and too pro-China. But that's not most of them. Most Democratic candidates could be quite anti-China. I testified a number of times to Congress last year. Democratic members of the House and Senate are very critical of China. So I think we're in the middle of a debate. We're seeing it in the administration. My opening remark was intended to convey that the administration disagrees with each other. It's not intended to convey that it's an illegitimate disagreement. It's a legitimate disagreement. We're having it within the administration. We're having it within the parties. D.C. is more anti-China than I think the country is as a whole. So there's sort of an implied debate there, where, is the country going to move towards Washington's view?
Why do you think there's a disconnect between D.C. and the country?
I think the number one thing that has changed views in D.C. is kind of a deeper understanding of Chinese politics than ordinary Americans should bother to have. Like, why would ordinary Americans care that much about Chinese politics? And I think the number two thing is a fear that Chinese technology theft and coercion is now intruding on areas of American military preeminence, so that a conflict which the Chinese might consider a conflict with the United States to be more, survivable or winnable. Not this year, not next year, but 5 or 10 years from now. So you have the defense community concerned about the trajectory of China's military challenge to the U.S., and you have the political community concerned about Xi Jinping. And both of those things are a bit esoteric for the rest of the country, which is, got angry because the president said the trade deficit costs millions of jobs. But we have a low unemployment rate. How bad is it? How bad is China really? They're not good, as the rest of the country's attitude might be. But it can't be that bad, because the economy's going okay now. Could be better. China could be better. But they don't see the political and security risk that's emphasized in Washington.
Okay. You have been a longtime student of China and China's development. You've been watching it very closely, following investment patterns and the like. This administration has, in a way, invited us to sort of play a counterfactual game, which was, they said, it was a mistake to let China into the WTO and to get as far. So maybe you can help, and I've actually argued they're wrong, because if you look at the counterfactual, it's hard to see what other path led us to a better outcome. Maybe you see one. What is the alternative where we look back, and back around 2000, 2001, we don't let China into the WTO, and how does that play out?
So you and I should probably go back and forth about this a couple times, because it's a big question and we have different views. I think it was understandable that we let China in the WTO. I don't look back at anyone saying, how could these people be so stupid? The China that we started negotiating with in the late 1990s under the Clinton administration was reforming. It was actually engaged in meaningful pro-market reform, difficult pro-market reform. That China looked like a good negotiating partner. That China looked like it's a big economy, not as big as it is now, but nonetheless a big growing economy doing the right thing. Of course we want them in the WTO.
Right.
So right up until 2002, after they're in, this looks like the right thing to do. Now, you don't have to believe President Clinton's rather famous, oh, they'll become a democracy kind of hand-waving, don't worry about the politics, it'll all work out. You don't have to believe that. The society was becoming more open, the economy was becoming more open. It made sense for us to negotiate. What we failed to anticipate, and nobody cared what I thought back then, but I also failed to anticipate it. This isn't what oh, I told everyone we shouldn't do it. I didn't know either. What we failed to anticipate was we got a change in Chinese government, and they said, that's enough reform. We got in the WTO, no more of this. And we had in some areas slow, in some areas fairly sharp, re-centralization of the Chinese economy. More bank lending by state banks to state-owned enterprises who then engaged in fixed investment, who overproduced and dumped the extra production onto partners who are now promised through the WTO to give them market access. So what we should have done, and this is absolutely 20/20 hindsight, is had better tripwire mechanisms for a reversion in Chinese behavior. And we didn't think about it because we were convinced that they were on this path to reform that they'd been on for 20 years, and they weren't going to get off of it. And so what we were really talking about is how much foreign participation would they allow, as opposed to they're going to junk that development model and they're going to go back to one that's antithetical to being a good WTO partner. I don't know how we could have fixed that at the time, but we could have made it a little better by having more tools that the US could use in case China did things that the Chinese government that we were negotiating with would have said, well, we're never going to do that. So we could have said, well, just humor us. This is a political thing that we need. Some sort of mechanism, not to every year, not every other year, to reevaluate reciprocity, to reevaluate national treatment. That's, in retrospect, what we needed because we got a change in the Chinese development model and we had no means to respond to it. And I know you don't agree, so.
I don't. Well, I think several things. So first, it's worth remembering that that deal where we let China in and we promised to give them MFN treatment, to give them tariffs as low as we give to our most favored nation, we had already been doing our side of that deal since 1980. And the U.S. had decided that that was in our interest.
But we had an annual review.
Yes, we had an annual review, which was a bit of a kabuki dance, and each side of Congress would take turns who was going to block the thing from really having teeth. That survived Tiananmen Square. That survived Bill Clinton's campaign. We were pretty committed over 20 years to having stuck with.
Well, but we applied significant sanctions after Tiananmen.
Yes, I know, but generally, do we do MFN tariff treatment? We did MFN tariff treatment. And so the real novelty in them joining was China taking on a lot of obligations. So it was in that sense a fairly one-sided deal. So that's point number one, that the alternative of saying like, well, we're not going to let you take on lots of obligations doesn't seem like a step in the right direction. I guess the other thing I would note is we did have not the sort of political reconsideration reciprocity mechanism per se, but there were things like the special China safeguard, which was not politically oriented, but it said if Chinese exports were causing disruption or so forth, and we chose not to use it very much, and for good reason, I think.
Okay, so there's
all right. We tried both with and without. Bush administration did not do it. Obama administration showed why the Bush administration didn't do it when they tried doing tires.
Yeah, tires is not where I would have started since it's a tiny, tiny, tiny little amount of Chinese trade in the United States. You would start with computers, cell phones, the large trade items. But a number of points. The production moved into China in a very clear and significant way after the U.S. removal of the annual MFN review, because that was a source of uncertainty. So we gave up something that mattered to the Chinese. Look at China's balance of payment surplus after WTO entry. It skyrockets. And their growth accelerates along with it. And at that period, it is export-led growth. It's not always export-led growth. It's not export-led growth now. But it is in that period. So we did give them something that turned out to be quite valuable to them. The way reversing that would have mattered. I also argue when you say, we had safeguards that we didn't use, and that was the right decision, we had a very serious disruption of U.S. manufacturing, 2001 to 2004. And it was, sort of anesthetized by an unsustainable expansion in U.S. construction employment, which then came crashing down on our ears. I am not blaming China for all this. Certainly, they're not the ones who failed to use the safeguards. And I'm not blaming them for the financial structure of the U.S. economy. But I don't think it's accurate, or I don't. It's whether it's accurate. I disagree that we shouldn't have used safeguards. We should have used more of the mechanisms that we had. And part of the reason you have this backlash later is because when I talk to ordinary Americans, they remember that the U.S. government didn't protect them against China. Now, they may have some cloudy memories of did they really lose their job to China or did they lose it to automation, but some of them did lose their job to China because you can do the econometrics and show that. And the U.S. government didn't do anything. And that was a mistake. And that's one of the reasons you have a lot of anti-China sentiment now, because when President Trump says, hey, I've got a deal and we're going to enforce it, people are going to say, I've heard this before, and you didn't enforce it, and I got hurt, and you did nothing.
I think you can do the econometrics wrong, and you can show that. I think you're referring to a literature, of course, that has sort of come out, which I think part of the problem is it does not take into account what were the alternative sources of supply. That China was at the vanguard of sort of supplying these low-cost imports. One of the things we learned from those safeguard cases, there were 5 of those safeguard cases during the Bush administration. I sat on 2 of them. One of the things we learned was in those instances where you said, let's protect the American people, and these should have been the strongest cases, right? Because these were the people who crossed the threshold, were willing to file, to take on the cost. They thought protection would actually help. The evidence that was presented to us was it wouldn't have helped. That if you didn't get the imports from China, in one case you were going to get it from Vietnam, in the other case you were going to get it from Brazil or from India. And you made the point earlier that actually we've seen in ensuing years, China's not the low-cost supplier for everything. We are seeing shifts where Vietnam undercuts them or Sri Lanka may undercut them. And that wasn't an overnight occurrence. They were standing right behind them all along. Right. That's the problem with a lot of those econometrics, is that they don't take that into account.
Okay, so I mean, I think that I certainly agree with the general point that, and in contrast to sometimes what the president implies, that if you push production out of China, it's all coming to the U.S. That's not going to happen.
Right.
It's going to go to other countries. Some will come to the U.S. Most will not. So that's going to be true. So I see your point with regard to China and the WTO, that if we didn't let China and the WTO, it's not like there would be no import shock to the U.S. I agree. But the import shock, 1, was more concentrated. And 2, and this is a fundamental issue. And I can quantify it, but the quantification is not very precise. I'd rather run trade deficits with decent trade partners than trade deficits with bad trade partners. And there are 2 reasons for that. 1, I don't like bad trade partners, period. It's like I want to go into a store that treats me well and give them my money, and the other store treats me poorly. It's the same amount of money. I'd rather go into the store that treats me well. But second, the bad trade partners are undermining the whole point of why comparative advantage. So the whole idea of why economists don't mind trade deficits is, if that's what's supposed to happen in the trade relationship, it's supposed to happen. One country saves more, one country spends more, one country's richer, one country's poorer. That's not a problem. But if somebody is undermining comparative advantage by stealing IP, and you happen to be where your comparative advantage is innovation, that trade deficit doesn't necessarily represent the right market outcome. And
you're not arguing for the importance of bilateral trade deficits here, like the president. Surely when you're sort of talking about savings and all this, you're talking about overall trade deficits, which you just said had gone away for China.
China's aggregate surplus has gone away for us. I am actually arguing the point about bilateral trade deficits, not the way the president does.
Oh, good.
Yes. I'm not arguing that the bilateral trade deficit represents millions of lost U.S. jobs. Good. I am arguing, you are saying, and I agree, my point is, China joining the WTO concentrated the blow to American manufacturing. However, if we didn't let China in the WTO, we would have a slower process of moving manufacturing from, first of all, the East Asian countries that were the source of a lot of U.S. manufacturing supply, diffusing it out to the rest of Asia, moving it into Mexico, and so on. It still would have happened. It would have happened, in my opinion, more slowly. My point is, I'd rather run a $100 billion trade deficit with Mexico than with China. Not because I think that that will save us jobs, but because the analogy I just used, I want to deal with a better trade partner, and because the bilateral trade deficit does not have like automatic economic necessary connotations, but it, that trade deficit is legitimate when it's not distorted by market intervention. And when the Germans are the largest current account surplus in the country and the world, that may not be ideal for a variety of reasons. It bothers me a lot less than when the Chinese were doing it, because the Chinese are market distorting actors to a much greater extent than the Germans are. So what we didn't know we were getting a statist partner in China. We thought we were getting a reforming partner. In retrospect, I'd rather have that same exact aggregate trade deficit with India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Mexico, and so on than the one we had with China, because they're bad actors.
What are the really odd things about the claim the administration is making about how the WTO cannot fit a country like China in is exactly that it was not an organization that was created only for economic purists. That's not wasn't written in the GATT. It's not written in the WTO. You have a whole spectrum of countries that think, some of which that the state sector should be very large, some of it that think state sector should be very small, and then they find particular deals on which they say, hey, this could be mutually beneficial. And you're very well aware of the old adage that just because the other country throws rocks in their harbor doesn't mean that we ought to. All right, we'll agree to disagree on some of that stuff, although I'm not sure we did on the WTO entry. Let's turn, because I want to get to audience questions very shortly. Let's spend some time on where the dealing is now and where it's going. You have been mentioning, you've really focused on intellectual property theft as your sort of principal complaint against China in our discussion here. And that, of course, was part of the basis of doing the Section 301 investigation. Right. And yet, when one hears reports of the administration's negotiating stances, that's just one in a long list of things that one's talking about. One's talking about bilateral trade deficits. One's talking about agricultural sales, state-owned enterprises, China 2025. What is this discussion focused on, and what ought it to be focused on?
Okay. Beginning of August 2017, there's a meeting in the White House in which I am at. It has 3 cabinet members in it and other senior people. And then a couple of other people like me. And we're deciding we're going to launch the 301. And I am patting myself on the back because it's not about currency manipulation. It's not about the trade deficit. I said I wanted to be out either IP or subsidies. They chose IP because there's a national security component. And I said, great, I'm with you. And the next day, a very senior White House political figure said, I just came from the Oval. The president loves this. He wants tariffs right away. And as you can imagine, I remember thinking, we didn't mention tariffs yesterday. Not once. Did not mention tariffs in the discussion the day before at all. So what we had is a campaign that I think the president's campaign did a service to the country by raising attention to our relationship with China, which I think we needed to reevaluate in light of the Chinese government that had taken over in 2012 and 2013. And we had a good start where we were focused on real issues. China coercing American companies in violation of their WTO commitments, China stealing on a huge basis from a lot of companies around the world. And it got taken over by US politics really, really fast, the next day. And US politics, as you know, when talking about China or a lot of other issues, but certainly about China, everybody has their own ask. So the president automatically gets his ask, which is buy a lot of stuff so the bilateral trade deficit shrinks, even though that has nothing to do with the 301. Agriculture has a special ask, which got put in there because they felt the brunt of the Chinese sanctions. So we said, OK, not we, because I didn't make this decision, we'll be nice to you and we'll make you a priority as well. Currency got an ask because we have this history in the US of complaining about Chinese currency manipulation, which is unevenly grounded. The Chinese do manipulate their currency. They manipulate their currency by pegging it to the dollar. So what we're really frustrated about is we can't make the dollar cheaper because the renminbi just follows the dollar down. And that's why we get angry, is that they're not letting us effectively manipulate our currency. But that has a history in the US government, and the president addressed it in his campaign, so that got put in. On top of the legitimate issues like IP, like subsidies to state-owned enterprises, like technical barriers to trade. So we have this mashed together agenda of substance and politics. And I was told in no uncertain terms, again, this is in the White House by very senior people whose names you would know, that they didn't say it this way, this is how I heard it, your nerd approach isn't going to convince anyone. Right? Fine, you're right about everything. No one's going to go for that. So there's a problem here that you need to sell your approach politically, because China was a national election issue in 2016. And what sells politically are claims that the bilateral trade deficit costs millions of jobs, and you've addressed it. Claims that China's a currency manipulator, that you're helping farmers. And then you have to do the substance, as charged to Ambassador Lighthizer, the United States Trade Representative, which is a whole different set of issues. And we've just smashed them together. And I'll put words in your mouth because I think you'll agree, and you'll just tell me if you don't. This has no chance of working out well.
Yeah, I agree. I don't usually outsource like that, but well, I think there's a sort of very useful concept, which I know you're familiar with, Sir Robert Putnam, with sort of two-level games, right, where you sort of have to. I liked your talk about your stance. What do you do to sell this domestically? But if you're going to be successful at it, that has to be consistent with what you're doing on the international stage. And ultimately, there are negotiations with the Chinese as well, and you have to be successful at that. The claim I have made is we actually had a chance with this president to be fairly successful with the Chinese if we could have maintained focus. Mm-hmm. If we could have picked just a couple of topics. Well, and I think the reason that you saw the Chinese come very quickly, I think they were relatively enthused to see President Trump win. Here's somebody who's transactional. They won't get many human rights lectures. They can just sit down and do business. Right. And if we had said, and you and I might even have been able to agree on what the issues were, cyber attacks, perhaps intellectual property. But you pick a couple issues and say, that's it. We need to have something effective on that. We're not going to get distracted with anything else. You either make us happy on that or we're unhappy, and that's it. You might have actually seen some progress. If you offer a very long menu, then they do what they seem to have done, which is, okay, which are the easiest things to accommodate here? I'll buy some soybeans, some sorghum, and we'll call it a day. Is that fair?
Look, I think the administration, I mentioned this before, I think the administration deserves some defense or credit for raising the issue and for reflecting the fact that we haven't decided within the Congress, within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party, within ordinary people, how we want to deal with these issues. If we take a poll in this room and we got 30 different approaches to China, it's understandable the administration reflects multiple different approaches to China. There's not been effective leadership on this issue. I would argue President Obama's very poor China policy, so it doesn't start with President Trump. But President Trump raised the stakes, and he has not been effective in leading because he wants what he really wants, which is a lower bilateral deficit and a lot of purchases. But he also wants to say, oh, yeah, that stuff that Lighthizer wants and all the eggheads say they want, we should do that too. And we've not set priorities. And I agree with you. We could have set priorities that Chinese wouldn't have gone for illegitimately, in my view, so it might not have worked. But the best way to make progress was to narrow the set of issues and say, this is it or nothing. No deal or we get this. Once we get here, it's unreasonable for us to say you have to give us 27 things or there's no deal. So the Chinese are going to pick and choose. And then we're back in where we are now, which is the administration fighting over, is it good enough or is it not good enough? So, excuse me, I agree with you. The administration missed an opportunity. But I think it's understandable they missed an opportunity because we have not decided as a country really what we want from our relationship with China.
Now, you're not a shy guy. You've been saying sort of publicly, or at least
I use the word fraud a lot.
A lot of the boards and discussions that we've both been on, that the administration essentially conceded in November. Why do you say that?
Okay, let's give the president, I say this all the time, saying, well, the best thing about the president is when he does something I hate, I just have to wait him out. Think about what I was implying there. The president could change his mind again. But in early November, the president, who had been saying more tariffs, it's illegitimate for the Chinese to respond to our tariffs because our tariffs correct predatory behavior by them that goes back years and years and years, suddenly flipped to and said in the White House, it was reported by only one outlet, but it was a correct report, go find me a deal with China. And once you say, go find me a deal with China, you've conceded, right? I mean, now we're just talking about the terms. You have to be able to say, I get this or I walk, whatever that is. And it's up to the president to decide. He gets to decide the priority, even if you and I hate it. But if you just say, go get a deal with China, you conceded. Now, the president could change his mind again. I happen to think in the middle of the election campaign next year, he's going to remember that he's a China hawk. But in November, he flipped, whether it was North Korea, whether it was the midterm elections, whether it was the stock market, I don't know. And we've been in since then, Ambassador Lighthizer, he would deny this, but I think he's not being entirely accurate, has been charged with getting a deal. Not negotiating and maybe it works, but getting a deal. And one example of a reason is, if the deal blows up tomorrow, what happens to the US stock market? Does the president want to take a risk of a US stock market tanking? If the deal blows up tomorrow, do the Chinese start encouraging the North Korean to be more belligerent? So there's a risk to no deal. And you might say the president was right to decide he wants a deal in November. But that's when there was a change. Up until the first week of November, the president was willing to push the Chinese, maybe not for the right objectives. And since then, he has not been. And you've seen this over and over again. You cannot go a week without a White House official saying, we're making great progress with China. We're making great progress with China. We're not. But you don't have to make great progress. All you have to do is decide, the president told me I have to have a deal by this time. This is the best deal I can get. And so we shifted from pressuring them, perhaps negotiating with them, to the president wants a deal, and now we're working toward that goal.
Okay, good. Well, so a few issues to toss out there for all of you. Let me now invite questions from the audience and make this sort of more participatory. We have one there at the back. Let's start there.
Hi, thanks. That better? Yeah,
yep.
There we go. Now I can hear it. Thanks for coming out. One thing, this shift to the, as you said, the kind of a DC consensus, very anti-China. It's been, it's really kind of been like a tornado. It kind of set in really quick, really recently. I'm wondering if some of that might be a little bit of expert career politicians covering for some of the things you guys just covered, which was, boy, did we misjudge that situation about letting them into the WTO. And then given what happened with that situation the past 18, 20 years, why should anybody go along with whatever's kind of the DC consensus at this time?
I live in D.C., and so you're asking me to defend D.C. It's not something I really want to do. You have to hope in American politics that we learn from our mistakes. Let's separate this from China. We have a problem of gainful, sustained employment for low-skilled labor in this country. It's a terrible social problem. It's an economic problem. It's occurring despite the fact that in other ways our economy is doing well. I think China is part of that issue. I don't think it's the bulk of it, but it's part of it. People should be responding to that. They should be looking for unusual measures. I think excessively low interest rates and running the economy hot and risking some goods inflation for the sake of higher wages, that might be justified now. A position I would not have taken 10 years ago. So I'm hoping what DC has done is learned from its previous mistakes, seen the impact of our relationship with China on the United States, seen the direction China is now going in, which was not evident certainly 15 years ago or 10, and is doing better. So that's my answer for why not to be cynical about DC. Now, I have to, because I'm in DC, give you a reason to be cynical about DC. I've been studying China for 25 years. Suddenly, I'm very popular. 4 years ago, most of these people, I'm in the press literally every day, and 4 years ago, none of the reporters knew my name. That's not because of me. It's because in 2016, it is perceived that Trump, being very anti-China on economic issues, may have helped him capture swing states. It's a very close election in the Electoral College. There are a number of crucial states that were very close, and this could have been the deciding factor. If that wasn't the case, I don't think you'd see all of a sudden rethinking and enlightenment about China. So the cynical part of me says, I don't think DC necessarily gets it wrong, but it's always politically motivated. And if the 2020 election has nothing to do with China, I think we will lose what appears to be the current DC consensus.
I'll take a somewhat more charitable view towards DC, which is for the same reason. Well, yeah, I did. But I've spent my time. But I think for the same reason that you said that Americans might not want to have an in-depth understanding of Chinese politics, in the same way they may not also explore what are the potential downsides to each of a range of policy actions that we take. Which, if you don't explore those, you may find some seemingly appealing options which turn out to have sort of major downsides. This is one reason we have representative democracy instead of direct democracy. You have a bit of a choice. You can either say, I'm going to put forth good people and then sort of trust the conclusions they come to, or you can say, I'm really going to delve into this issue deeply. Or you end up in a really unfortunate middle ground where you say, I'm going to make the policy choices without jumping into this and without trusting the people who are there. So I think that's sometimes where the DC consensus may come from people who thought they actually did spend a lot of time thinking about some of these issues. And what happens is you may get a conclusion. This was essentially what I concluded on the China and the WTO. Making the right choice does not guarantee that you have a lovely outcome that everyone is thrilled with. The right choice means you made the best possible outcome, so it was better than the alternatives that you actually had at hand. It's easy to say, well, I saw some downsides that came after. That doesn't mean there was a better choice. And so I think that's sometimes where that comes from. All right, let me bring in one from that we've had online. But another very DC question for you. What's the impact of a Democratic House majority, arguably more skeptical rate China, plus a Democratic presidential primary and the ongoing campaign on the whole China negotiations?
Well, I think it's a good question. I have said repeatedly, I don't understand what the president is thinking politically. Normally, you and I will talk about what is this obsession with the bilateral trade deficit? Why does he think that that represents millions of lost jobs when the bilateral trade deficit primarily increased the last 2 years because of his tax cut, and higher U.S. demand, not lost, didn't signify lost jobs. The U.S. aggregate trade deficit plunged in 2009. Does anyone remember that as a great time for jobs? No. So normally, my response to the president is, I don't get the economics of this. And I did get the politics of it, because let's remember, President Trump 10 years ago was a Democrat. He wins the Republican nomination and then shocks Hillary Clinton in the election. His political sense is pretty good. You may hate it. It doesn't, reality. He went from a no-name Democrat who had no chance at the nomination and then wasn't going to win the presidency, and he did all of those things. But I don't get the politics here, because I do think, as the question implies, next year you're going to have a Democrat attacking him from the hawkish side, a group of Democrats attacking from the hawkish side, and then the final nominee attacking from the hawkish side. The Congress, one of the few things, I tell this to the administration all the time, and they believe it, one of the few things I can get through the Congress, the Democratic House and the Republican Senate, is anti-China legislation. And if the administration goes too far on the deal, I'll get that anti-China legislation, and I'll upend their authority to make these deals. So, reflecting the first question and the second question, I think we're going to get more anti-China, whether wisely or unwisely, whether focusing on the right things where we should focus or the wrong things, because of politics. The Democrats are going to try to outflank the president on the hawkish side. The president doesn't like to be outflanked. We've seen that on immigration especially, but it's true on a number of issues. So I think next year's election is going to immediately undermine any deal that we sign now. I think the Chinese are aware of that. We're looking at, if we sign a deal at the end of March, beginning of April, it'll last about a year. That's my opinion.
You mentioned the possibility of, if the president goes too far in this deal, what would that mean? Is that sort of giving Huawei a pass? What is going too far?
Right,
what would rile up Congress?
Well, excellent sight there, because the number one thing that upset the Congress is when the president said, my Commerce Department just found that ZTE broke American sanctions and should face a denial order. Major Chinese telecom company. And he said, but I talked to Xi Jinping, and the famous quote is, too many jobs in China lost. That's a quote from a presidential tweet. And, I remember seeing that saying, that's got to be a mistake. It's going to get fixed.
No, not on a tweet.
Yes, hard to believe. That infuriated the Congress. It infuriated the Congress not because everyone was sure that the original punishment of ZTE was the right punishment, but because the president gave it away in a phone call with no apparent justification whatsoever. We have still not seen any justification. So the Congress, ever since then, has been extremely sensitive about Chinese telecom companies like ZTE and Huawei, about the Chinese threat in 5G. If if the administration is seen as not protecting U.S. technological advantage in the IP sections, or has a sidebar where they say, oh, you know, we won't take any action against Huawei, Huawei's fine, you're going to get congressional legislation. Now, most legislation doesn't pass the Congress because the Congress doesn't work. But in an election year, anti-China legislation will pass the Congress. And so you'd have that process start right away. It would include Republican senators right off the bat who would be angry at the president. And of course, House Democrats would eat this up because it's a way to discredit the Republican nominee for president in 2020. So that's a political constraint the president has to face. There are going to be people who denounce the deal no matter what. But if there seemed to be a repeat where he gave away something and got nothing, like ZTE, you're going to get congressional legislation that limits his authority.
All right, question over here, please.
Do you think we'd be in a better position vis-a-vis China if we had signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Oh, good. Phil and I can argue about this for the next hour. And my answer is no. I do think that going down the road of negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership and then not even getting close to a Senate vote hurt American credibility. There's no way to deny that. We don't look like a partner you can rely on, you negotiate with, and then there's no possibility of a trade vote. I blame that largely on the Obama administration. So there is a diplomatic harm to the TPP. With regard to China, and this is my #1 area of expertise, the competitive neutrality provisions in the Trans-Pacific Partnership governing the behavior of state-owned enterprises were so weak, they would have had no effect on the Chinese whatsoever. And I showed that to a variety of people by saying, here, I have just reorganized the Chinese state sector for you while I've been sitting in this room, and now none of the TPP provisions are binding, because they had huge holes that were insisted upon by the Singaporeans and the Vietnamese. The counter-argument, I'll let Phil give the counter-argument. A second problem is that when I did the calculations myself right after the text came out, I did not get a net increase in US services exports. And 6 months later, the ITC, the International Trade Commission, also did not get a net increase in US services exports. We should not be signing trade agreements where we don't export more services. We're the most comprehensively competitive services exporter in the world. And if you if you read the TPP, which I read twice, the non-conforming measures on services are so extensive that we were not going to get any benefit from it. Now, all right, I'll just say, because Phil might not go in this direction, the idea that the TPP was a starting point, that you could get better from there, okay, that's interesting. I don't think that's true, but at least that makes sense. The TPP itself was not going to bind the Chinese, and there was no way to sell it to the Congress because the services exports didn't add up.
I think we actually could have sold it. I think, were there flaws? Yes, Derek is correct. There are absolutely flaws. Was the state-owned enterprise chapter ideal? Nope, definitely wasn't. On the other hand, if you want to look at sort of ways to assert U.S. presence credibly in the region, something other than simply asserting it, that did this. And if you want to look at ways to influence Chinese behavior, you had Bob Zellick call this essentially a roadmap for China with reform. Does it lead to everything we would have wanted out of the Chinese? No, but it was much more effective than the gunboats in the harbor approach, which I don't think is going to end up getting us very much at all. So, all right, we have time for one last question. Let me go right here. Wait for a microphone will come to you.
Thank you. Mr. Scissors, if you were unlimited and could write a book about anything you liked, what would be the title and why, and what would it be about?
It would not be about anything we're talking about now, because I'm sick of it all. So no offense to your question. It's personally fascinating to me. I'm not sure it's interesting at all to the audience. I guess if I would write about it, it would be about. I'm a nerd, just to get this straight.
There's a good title.
Yes, that'd certainly draw a lot of buyers. I think the fundamental question, so one thing I think Phil and I very much agree on, but we haven't talked about, is the U.S. getting our own house in order is always more important than whatever we do with another country. That isn't true for a tiny economy. A tiny economy can be overwhelmed by the world, but that's not us. So our own policies matter more, even though my work is on China. I walk around telling people my work is secondary to getting our own policies right. Don't listen to me if you can do something on that front. I'd like to I'd like to think about, if I had lots of time, how to deal with a trade-off of inefficient job creation, jobs that don't make sense in a market economy, but that we need to keep families together, to keep people from being radicalized. How much we should inflict that on the world. The world might be like, hey, you know, how do you get to subsidize job creation for low-skilled labor and we don't? We have a terrible tax code where we reward people for replacing machinery really fast. Okay, use old machines and use more people. There are a lot of pluses and minuses here. I don't mean to oversimplify it. I don't think we've thought enough about how the labor market in the United States should work and whether maybe it shouldn't be as efficient as it is.
I think that's a very useful reminder about how, and it is a point on which we agree, which is that you have sort of other problems here. I'll go a step further. You can dissent if you like. That I think often China gets held up as a scapegoat for sort of other problems. That said, if we mishandle this relationship, there can be very serious repercussions. And so we are at an exciting, interesting time, but our time here has actually expired. So thank you all for joining us, and please join me in thanking Derek for being here.